there is substance in the budget, which is economic. And the presentation of the budget in the House is not the end of the budget, as many people come to appreciate it. The government has no luxury between the 12th and the 31st to allow a slippage in this whole process slipping into April. I think it gives us a certain perspective. And I recall when we had to swear in a president at short notice and tested the Constitution, which required that on the death of a president, it's envisaged that things would move smoothly. And I think to the surprise of many people, it moves smoothly. I don't want to compare this to that, level, but in terms of our economic management, it tells me, and it's not being contested, so it tells me that the Constitution is flexible enough to take care of economic crisis, including the absence of the chief executive, the president's top official in charge of the economy. So I see in that vein something that I envisage will be orderly. The majority leader, obviously, has been minority leader. It's a very long, serving member of Parliament. He normally even rounds up, the budget speeches in terms of, when the Minister for Finance finishes. So I have no doubt that he's capable of making not just a presentation, but he's already master in parliamentary procedures. And so you're not going to have somebody who is going to be probably fidgeting or being directed, being educated around this side, because it comes with, the presentation is made in line with the standing orders of the House. And so at the end of which, there's a formal laying of the budget on the authority of His Excellency, the President. But having said that, I agree with you also that this is historic, because I don't recall in my review of literature since independence and through our military era, where whoever is Minister for Finance, or even when the person is acting for the substantive Minister for Finance, who happens to be the head of state himself, there has been a vacuum where the minister is unable, to present the budget. And in this case, it's on grounds of illness also. And so I find it both gratifying in terms of the economy and the processes, and the testing of, emergencies, and also historic. That is something which I think will be, for economic advisors, economic historians, I think its significance might come later. Having said that, let me also point out that there is substance in the budget, which is economic. And the presentation of the budget in the House is not the end of the budget, as many people come to appreciate it. For many people, once the speech is over, they tune out. But the budget, as I said, at the end of the speech, which is just a summary, often extracted from the introduction to the budget, it's just a summary. And it's not a speech that is laid when that process, after you finish reading and you say, Mr. Speaker, or Right Honorable Speaker, I now take the opportunity to lay, which is a very formal House standing order. It is not a speech. It is the budget document and the estimates that are being presented to the House, following which the Speaker refers the budget document to the Finance Committee and to the relevant committees who are in charge of the estimates for ministries, departments, and agencies, and MMDAs. The process that follows that is very important. Under the Constitution, the economic policy of the administration must be debated by Parliament, presented to Parliament in the budget, debated, and it's actually the first resolution, because the economic policy is what underlies the estimates for various sectors of the economy. And normally you will see that, therefore, that it tends to mimic the State of the Nation address, the economic section of the State of the Nation address. So this is where the substance comes in. That the speech is reading something that is drafted, prepared, approved by Cabinet. The debate on the policy is substantive, and that is where the absence of the substantive Minister for Finance may be felt. Even that, at that point in time, the deputies often step in and attend to the House, because they can also debate. So often the minister may be engaged with other issues, but the deputies then step in. So I don't see a vacuum there. The deputy designates, provided that they are vetted, the course of the week before Friday and the following week, can step in. And you have some of them as economists in their own right, MPs, and of course much of the work is also technical. And that's where the Ministry of Finance as an institution, with deep institutional and historical memory, also comes in to support. And they are normally sitting at the back during debates. And what you may not notice at times is that there are often sleeping notes when you see the ushers coming in and out, right, or reminders. So I think that is also, first substance. Second substance, the budget, in the word budget, is an estimate. So that's an accounting aspect of figures, of the revenue that is coming in and of the expenditure, how that revenue is going to be used. And it is only Parliament that can legislate how the revenue should come in by way of taxation. And therefore, you can see that tax bills that would complement the budget are often laid as well, sometimes that night, because of the nature of taxation. Then the estimates are referred to, as I said earlier, to relevant committees. The committees then meet, and this is not necessarily economic. It can be real sector, because the Energy and Mines Committee meets the ministers for energy, for example, lands and natural resources. The Ministry of Finance itself, its own estimates goes to the Finance Committee together with the budget, itself. So all the committees then take the estimates, and some committees take more than one ministry because that's not that many, And the ministers come and defend the government's policy, underline the estimates, defend the estimates, and then they present a report, one after the other, to the House. And each of those reports is passed by resolution again. Right? And when all that is done, the reports on policy, the reports on past performance, the reports on where the government wants to take us, which is the gist of the budget, together with the estimates, the money to discharge that, responsibility or continue with some program which is being, pushed forward, is then is brought to the House and approved. And the estimates, which is the estimate of revenue and expenditure for each of the ministries as they are approved, are referred to the Finance Committee. And at the end of all the committees bringing in their work, right, and hopefully approved, the Finance Committee then puts all of them together and then comes up with the appropriation bill, which hitherto would have been drafted by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Justice, which advises on legal matters. And the Finance Committee, which itself presents the Finance Ministry and its agencies report as though, because the Ministry of Finance is also, a ministry. Its own budget and others are put together, and then a report is presented together with the appropriation bill, and it is only when the bill is passed by Parliament and forwarded to the President for assent that the budget process is set to come to an end. So you see the substance, both economic and non-economic in many instances. And this is a process which the minister monitors closely, because you have the Parliament's own budget, you have the budget of the judiciary, which cannot be changed by the ministry or cabinet, but must be tabled with recommendations to the House, so all of those things. So the minister has to monitor all of these things, the recommendations. So this is substantive, and it is the minister who moves the Appropriation Act. So again, at the end, I envisage that the period may be short for the minister to come and be vetted, to come and take over his responsibility midstream. But we can therefore see the Honorable Majority, Leader coming back to, take care of the appropriation bill, which again is a legislative process, and as a legislator, he can discharge that responsibility. But the deputies would have come in through the appropriation process, which includes debt service and other commitments, and that responsibility too can be discharged. So I envisage that, the process, would be accomplished. Okay. But you can see from what I'm saying that these are all has some history behind them, which is going to change. This whole process takes minimum 4 weeks, most optimistic. But usually is if the budget is presented early November, it takes about 7 to 8 weeks. Because you would note that, but for the election years, when we present the budget around this time, the budget is presented early November, and the appropriation bill is often tabled invariably around the 22nd or 23rd of December, and then parliamentarians rise for the Christmas, break. But the other reason why this has become important and critical, and some have even described it as a possible crisis, is because you recall that in December, Parliament passed the expenditure in advance of appropriation. And it allows, because the budget can be presented in an election year, every 4 years, consistently, we have gone to Parliament to ask for money to run government for 3 months. And the Constitution requires that it should be for 3 months, first quarter. But it's not related to elections. It doesn't use election language. It says in the event that the budget cannot, I'm paraphrasing, the budget cannot be presented, right? Parliament can pass, at the end of the year, right? Parliament can approve or appropriate, because only Parliament that can approve, an amount or estimate that would be sufficient to run government for the first 3 months, end of, March. So the scenario you have is that Parliament hasn't got the luxury, and I don't know if there is another procedure emergency process or something in the constitution that can be invoked. Otherwise, the government has no luxury between the 12th and the 31st to allow a slippage in this whole process slipping into April, which Christian as our nation is also, with Easter beckoning and all that, keeping Parliament. And so it means that if you look at what is about to happen because of the delay in vetting the minister, then we are going to cram something that happens in 6 weeks, in 2.5 weeks at best. It is possible the Parliament will have to work overtime. And there are new members of Parliament. The House has a lot of new members of Parliament. So the old hands would have to steer, things a lot. And it may be a good learning process, for new MPs because it's going to be very intense. Each of the committees looking at their, and baptism in government policy, be very intense. So they may have to work day and night, including some weekends, to have the process, completed, so that we don't have the US-style government shutdown, because there will be no money to buy fuel, no money to do other things. But as I said, I'm not sure if there is a provision which government is thinking which can make some emergency appropriation to the government and allow additional more days. So that is something again which, given developments, we are going to. But let me make another point on this. I think what I have said has given enough reason why normally after an election, even if the government, succeeds itself, the Minister for Finance is often the first. But in the case of the last elections, because of the senior minister, he was the first, but the Minister for Finance is the second to be vetted. In order that, and the reason is that this is done sometimes early in January after the handing over, to allow the minister to take over the budget responsibilities and present the budget earlier than we are seeing, now. And so that is why I said that it is testing our ability also in an emergency, where someone has to step in, to see the alternative scenario, which is, but it's not going to be, it's going to be a really, cramped program. And remember, Parliament is also going to be considering the State of the Nation address. That's some of those debates. I don't know about the president's one, whether it will be deferred to the next sitting of Parliament to give priority to the budget. But that is the chief executive's, statement. And so I'm keen to look at the business statement that will be made in the House. A tough budget. No question about it. And the numbers speak for itself. And the numbers have been some of the alternative numbers that are coming out, that were used to come out, including some of us disputing certain things being done on, say, a narrow basis. You have institutions like Moody's, the IMF, and others, showing what you call the parallel, numbers. So to give you an example, debt is at 80%. We shouldn't be comfortable with 80%. And I have said that we cannot compare ourselves to a developed country which is borrowing at 100%. They are borrowing at almost negative rates, interest rates now, 1%, 2%, at most 4%. We do our borrowing and bonds, the best is, not even 6%, but 8%. So the cost of borrowing is high, and it takes a lot of money to service as a poor country or a developing country. So debt at that level is unsustainable. It's been described, Ghana has been described as being at risk of debt distress. It is also not sufficient comfort that the deficit, which the government itself, if you take 3 of their documents, originally said 2020 deficit was going to be 4.5 or 4.7%. by the time the media review was being read, had risen to 8.5. But if you add the energy costs, which are taken out of the narrow basis, the government's, if you add it, it gives the government's own deficit as 11+%. Now, there has been some effort to attribute most of this to COVID. But we have had the occasion to go to the IMF to get money for COVID. And we had told the IMF that the cost of borrowing is between 2.3 to 2.5%. So even if you added the cost of COVID to the 4.5, 2.5 plus 4.5, you are having about 7%. So if your deficit is around 13%, and Fitch and others have said it could be 15% or more, what is accounting for the gap? And it's explained by the adjustments that were made when the media review was presented. It is basically energy, arrears, bailout costs, which is another form of arrears, additional money for interest payment. Remember I spoke about the cost of, borrowing, additional payments for wage arrears. And as we speak, government has not even finished negotiation with labor, which means that whatever is in the expenditure in advance of appropriation will be conservative. And so if you take the last indicator, which is suggesting that government could do 2021 deficit of 8.5, right? That is a climb down from about 15 to 18% to 8%. We have done IMF programs, we've done under austere conditions and whatever. We have never reduced the deficit by that number before. We have never done it, except for the set-off that was done in 2017. And even that was 2.3%. And so it tells you that the projections that the government presented in the expenditure in advance of appropriation may be very conservative. Worse still, that 8.5% was achieved, was projected because arrears were left out. If you take the expenditure in advance of appropriation and the medium-term expenditure framework, there's no provision for arrears. There's no provision for bailout costs. And even as we speak, it's being paid, and we're in 2021. There's no provision for energy, costs. So if you add that, I don't envisage how, which would have increased the deficits carried. I don't envisage how we could do a deficit reduction, from about 15% to 8%. Remember, if you have a big deficit, you must finance it, and that means borrowing. And so being at 80% and envisaging a large, fiscal deficit means that we are going to borrow. And if you borrow domestic, it means you are crowding out credit to the private sector. If you borrow externally, already we are being told that our debt is unsustainable. And Moody's has said that we could be at 80%. The Bank of Ghana came out with 74.4%, if you remember. But that figure is up to the end of November. It doesn't include December figures. So it means that the debt could be closer, to Moody's calculation of 80%, which is what, some of us also. And so you see enormity of borrowing, which already the minister had indicated for refinancing. The bond alone is 5 billion, and we are not yet in the market for that. So if you look at the fiscal situation, it is not. And if we are going to follow the advice of the governor, who made two very important, if not profound statements. One, he said the bank may not be in a position to provide, support for the budget. Remember that the bank gave 10 billion last year, to the Ministry of Finance, which is more than what we got from the IMF. Right? So if you convert, it's about 1.7 billion US dollars, right, from the IMF, which is higher than the 1 billion we borrowed from the IMF. So if you add the IMF to the central bank alone, before you bring in what World Bank and others gave us, then you are talking about, 2.7 or nearly 3 billion US dollars of support after we had gone to the market to borrow 3 billion, in sovereign bonds. So it means that budget support for last year is hovering around 6 billion US dollars. This could not be attributed to COVID. Because if you multiply by 5, or 5.4, approximately, 5 points, let me use even 5 exchange rate, at 6 billion, you're talking about 30 billion, Ghana cedis. What is it that is opening that such a huge gap? The answers are in past offsets that were done, the narrow basis for computation, which the fund and others started to adjust. So whilst we were saying the deficit was 5%, IMF adjusted and said it's 5.6. While we said it was 4.5, they adjusted and said it was 7%. So this is the scenario. So when I say it's tough, this is what I mean by the situation is going to be tough, and we have to do our own austerity, or austerity will be forced on us. Austerity is not a bad word. It only means sacrifice. And I often relate it, to households. We're in COVID. In many households, the breadwinner has lost their jobs, beginning even before COVID, with the banking sector crisis, the collapse of the banks, and others. What does the family do? They move into austere mode. Austere mode means food is a priority, school fees is a priority, rent is probably a priority. If you are not in your own house, it's a priority. Many other expenditures are suspended. That family is being austere. Right? Otherwise, the consequence, like the nation, is to borrow. It's to go borrowing. Right? They suspend certain expenditures. And therefore, government will have to follow suit. And that is why I found it, in my tweet recently that, the government is promising 100 billion Ghana cedis, of stimulus into the economy. That is on average. If you divide by 4, that gives you about 25 billion annually. And you divide again by 6, and you're at 4 billion. All right? And that is the amount needed for only infrastructure. But there's no space in the budget for our own money to finance that. So it's borrowing. And the reason I say there's no space is that 2 items in the budget, which is compensation and interest payment, is taking between 105 and 115, depending on the year and the statements, the budget statement you are talking about, is taking 110 to 115%. There was a time when it shot up to almost 145. You added arrears and everything of tax revenue, which means that you've exhausted your tax revenue and you're even borrowing to pay those 2 items before you come to the amount needed to service government offices, amount needed for development, even if you borrow the repayment. And so, I remember this excludes amortization, repayment of principal, right? So, I do not think that it's possible to defend investors and others, except for those on the periphery. What we call, those who lend, to countries in a crisis at very high interest rates because they know the country, will be wary of default. At this point in time, you need soft loan. You don't need a lot of. If we can get soft loan as substitute, it's very important. And the World Bank is the premier institution for giving soft loans, even as a middle income country. We have become middle income, so we don't have the soft sets of loans. So the World Bank has a board, and you have to convince them, that government has and a steer program to pull back from where it is headed. Right? You may need balance of payment support if the borrowing and other things affects Bank of Ghana, crowding and interest rate and others. So you may need, or if there's a collapse in commodity prices and others, which comes from the IMF as the lender of last resort for developing countries which are in crisis. It's only the IMF that has a wherewithal, not even African Development Bank, which also comes in any way to support. So you need a coalition of all of this, including your DFIDs, your USAIDs and others. So at that point, the development partners together with the EU who are supporting your education programs, they are supporting your health programs, they are supporting, wants to make sure that you are cutting your coat according to their size. Because remember, their citizens would also be asking for accountability and they must justify it. So let me be very practical in, people say we went to the IMF for policy credibility. This is a story. The truth is that that word was coined, yes, at Senchi, right? And it was used. But the reality is that at a point when the development partners realize the enormity of single spine arrears, which, by the way, is much smaller than the arrears figures that we are talking about today, right? Even though we have 3 oil fields, not one. When they realize that, they pulled budget support. And pulling budget support means that your support for education, for health, and for other, critical soft areas of the economy was going to suffer. And we were about to go and do not the 2013, but between the 2013 and 2014 budget. And the only condition they set was the only institution that can give them the assurance that your program is tenable, your program is workable, your path to austerity, which you said. And remember, we had a homegrown policy, is the IMF. The rating agencies from whom you are going to do your bond and others also started to ask for, that. So it's when you get to that point, that countries go to the IMF. But I would like to remind Ghanaians that we have gone back to the IMF already. After the exit. The RCF is a program. It's a rapid credit facility, just as the ECF, which is the enhanced credit facility. The only thing is that it has less conditions. And the RCF, by the way, is a COVID law, right? So if you were solid, you wouldn't go asking for that loan. If you were solid, your central bank won't be financing, which, by the way, the central bank had not supported any government to that level since the 70s going into the 1980s. After ERP, the central bank, because it's bad practice. Right? So the central bank has never supported. The law permits only 5% of your previous year's revenue, which in our case, again, was denied under the zero financing policy from the Bank of Ghana. Honestly, I hold back in advising other ministers of finance. And the reason is simple. It sounds a bit presumptuous because, one, much of what I've said, you can see I'm picking from official documents, from other sources, credible sources and the rest. But I'm not in cabinet to know the real situation. As we speak, what is the arrears for free SHS? And we can't say that free SHS hasn't got arrears. Of course, there was a relief in they are not going to school, but they are going back to school. They're going back to school. What is the true liability for the energy sector? Right, we keep hearing figures. 2 billion, 3 billion. Right, the government itself has considered that ESLA, which is bringing 41 billion, where did the revenue go? It has not been sufficient to defray, the arrears, which was $2.2 billion, which even at today's exchange rate, if you take even $6, 6 Ghana cedis to the dollar at 2.2 is a mere 15, billion. ESLA is bringing 41 billion. Why haven't we been able to resolve, those crises? What is taking the money? 3 oil fields instead of 1, right? And we do have this. I believe you heard from the vetting, contracted road arrears and others. So the only reason I'm hesitant is that, even the advice may be off the mark. So we are waiting for the budget to see. And at that point, but I think I've said enough, generally using, to show, that the way is only pointing to austerity, which we must do ourselves.